Looking back, there seems to have been a direct correlation between the quality of console wrestling games and the quality of its real-world counterpart. Beginning with a slew of games for the Nintendo 64, titles like 1998's WCW NWO Revenge, 1999's WWF WrestleMania 2000, and 2000's WWF No Mercy mirrored the rise and popularity of pro wrestling at the time. It should be noted that all of these games were published by THQ, with the latter two being developed by Yuke's, a partnership that would endure for years, and the one that would be responsible for releasing the game we're talking about today. For those not in the know, professional wrestling had adopted a more violent, sexual, and outright controversial edge in the late 1990s. Spearheaded in 1996 in WCW with the heel turn, or bad guy turn for the layman, of Hulk Hogan. He, along with his faction known as the New World Order, or NWO for short, ushered in the era of the cool villain. Whereas previously Hogan had been the all-American hero good guy, or babyface as it's known colloquially in pro wrestling, his new persona, dressed all in black and known as Hollywood Hogan, represented the kind of hip bad guy that fans were starting to cheer over the traditional white meat babyfaces of old. Following suit, the WWF introduced their own anti-hero in Stone Cold Steve Austin. And following the controversial exit of one Bret Hart from the company at the hands of Vince McMahon, a subject that's just too complicated to delve into here, the company turned the malicious fan reaction to McMahon as a result of the incident into a new storyline and character. Hence, Mr. McMahon was born, and his rivalry with Stone Cold, along with Austin himself, would go on to be the hottest thing in wrestling for years to come. All of this correlated with the emergence of more risque storylines and increasingly violent in-ring action. The NWO's antics were portrayed as so realistic that police were often called to live television tapings as a result of concerned phone calls from nearby residents. The WWF was including storylines involving human sacrifices, abductions, and porn stars, to go with more dangerous and detrimental in-ring antics involving 16-foot cells, ladders, thumbtacks, and egregious chair shots to the head. Meanwhile, a fringe wrestling company called ECW, which literally stood for Extreme Championship Wrestling, built its entire promotion almost exclusively around the more gratuitous and hardcore elements of what the WWF dubbed the Attitude Era. While many people argue the overall quality of the product at the time, for me, the Attitude Era was the absolute best time in wrestling history, especially as far as the WWF was concerned. The in-ring work was crisp and sharp, while also becoming more death-defying. The presentation was exceptional and undeniably cool, and the stories, while not always necessarily consistent, were more often than not more entertaining than anything that came before or since. The peak of said era corresponded directly with the peak of video game wrestling of the fifth generation, which came in the form of the 2000's WWF No Mercy. Building upon the foundation laid in place in WrestleMania 2000, it gave players a then unprecedented level of in-ring gameplay, customization options, game modes, and, perhaps most importantly, story mode depth. By the spring of 2001, with the WWF's acquisition of WCW, the folding of ECW, and arguably the greatest wrestling pay-per-view of all time, WWF's WrestleMania 17, the Attitude Era unofficially came to an end. However, the embers of the era still burned brightly for the next couple of years after these events. In many ways, the 2 years following WrestleMania 17 served as the unofficial Attitude Era half-life, a purgatory of sorts between the death throes of said era and the birth of the next one, known as the Ruthless Aggression Era. The storylines were somewhat tamer while still being adult-orientated, and the character development and presentation wasn't quite as edgy, but was still pretty exciting. However, the one place where the company arguably improved was in the actual in-ring work. Legends like The Rock, Stone Cold, and Hulk Hogan were entering the twilight years of their careers, while other established veterans like Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Kane, and The Undertaker were entering the second phases of theirs. However, it was the surge of the company's newest stars like Brock Lesnar and Kurt Angle, along with the up-and-coming talent like Eddie Guerrero, Edge, Chris Benoit, Rey Mysterio, Shelton Benjamin, and Rob Van Dam, among many others, that really upped the in-ring quality. Now more than ever, there was a new emphasis on technical ability and exceptional work ethic over stunts and insane shenanigans. I think this is emblematic of where wrestling games were at this time also. WWE SmackDown Here Comes the Pain was released in late 2003. 2003, in my opinion, was the last really great year in professional wrestling, with that year's WrestleMania signalling a true end of an era for the company and the industry as a whole. Stone Cold wrestled his last match, while The Rock and Hogan would never compete in a full-time capacity for the company again after this show. Brock Lesnar also dethroned Kurt Angle in the main event for the WWE title, signifying a change of the guard. What should be clear by now is the sheer depth of the WWE's roster at this time, and most of these big names found their way onto Here Comes the Pain. In total, there are 64 playable male, female, and legendary wrestlers. However, what's truly exhausting about the list is not the actual volume of characters, but the sheer number of icons which appeared on the main roster alone. A short list, and I use that term lightly, of these names include Batista, Booker T, Brock Lesnar, Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, the Dudley Boys, Eddie Guerrero, Edge, Goldberg, John Cena, Kane, Kevin Nash, Kurt Angle, Lita, Randy Orton, Rey Mysterio, Ric Flair, Rob Van Dam, The Rock, Scott Steiner, Shawn Michaels, Stone Cold, Triple H, Trish Stratus, and The Undertaker, who can all be controlled along with legends like the Iron Sheik, Jimmy Snuka, the Road Warriors, Roddy Piper, Sergeant Slaughter, and Ted DiBiase. So with the roster established, how is the game's overall presentation? The menus and interface are fine and fully functional, if a little unpretty, maintaining the SmackDown aesthetic with razor-sharp category columns and animations of the game's most popular wrestlers, shuffling as you go from one menu to the next. The only thing I have an issue with here is the music, which is a combination of nu metal guitars, drum and bass percussion, and industrial screams and effects. Now, this by itself isn't a bad thing, and is actually very indicative of the kind of music they would have played on WWE programming at the time. Unfortunately, however, it's just not well composed. For those of you who've never heard it, it kind of sounds like one of those mediocre copyright-free tracks you can find on YouTube. Not bad for an amateur YouTuber like myself, but for a billion-dollar company with an in-house compositional genius like Jim Johnson, it amazes me that they couldn't have come up with a better soundtrack. Also, let's not forget that other sports games like Madden and FIFA had been using licensed soundtracks for years at this point, something THQ and Ukes would adopt in the very next WWE game, SmackDown vs. Raw. Even if the team didn't want to fork out the extra cash for licensed music, they still had about 60 different entrance themes to pick from, which would have actually made a far more enjoyable soundtrack. Anyway, I wanted to get that grievance out of the way, as it's one of very few I have with the game. Now, onto the wrestlers themselves. It's challenging to gauge the quality of the models of a near 20-year-old wrestling game through modern eyes. That said, I can say with little trepidation that for the time, the wrestlers looked really, really great. And while by today's standards, some of the mannerisms seem a little stiff, and some of the textures a little muddy, when you see The Rock walk towards the ring or Brock Lesnar clothesline someone in it, there's no second guessing who you're looking at. Speaking of in-ring violence, it was the action in between the ropes where the game was most revolutionary compared to what came before, and, somewhat embarrassingly, most replayable when compared to what came after. Prior SmackDown games were relatively straightforward and arcadey. You had about half a dozen striking and grappling attacks, if that, meaning your character's moveset was somewhat limited. Striking and aerial attacks were also completely context sensitive, meaning that unless you lined up a top rope elbow drop perfectly or gauged the distance of a punch or a kick with pinpoint accuracy, the impact would often be glancing and thus look weak or ineffective. Here Comes the Pain fixed both these problems simultaneously by offering a wider variety of situational positions for grappling exchanges and introducing specific animations for strikes and high-flying maneuvers. Now, instead of just lunging at an opponent, resulting in a pile driver out of nowhere, players had to lock up with their opponents using the circle button with a corresponding directional button. From here, 4 things could happen. You could hit a wrestling move using the same circle directional command, You could kick or punch your opponent from the clinch. You could disengage entirely or Irish whip them, or your opponent could counter with a move of their own. This was a much more challenging, fun, fair and dynamic system, allowing room for a more diverse set of attacks, while also giving you a chance to counter when on the receiving end. There were also 4 different types of attacks: speed, power, technical and submission. Another new feature which was introduced in this game were more realistic wrestling physics. For example, if a smaller wrestler like Tajiri tried a power move like a suplex on a giant like the Big Show, he'd be unable to complete the move and actually cause damage to himself. Gone were the days when Stephanie McMahon could powerbomb Kane with little to no effort. The aforementioned animations meant that executing striking moves, particularly high-flying moves off the top rope, ladders and true ropes, were much more satisfying and true to the choreography of the real-life product. Unless you completely misjudge the distance of a top rope moonsault or a crossbody plancha, your body will land on your opponent flush, assuming they don't counter it. Another cool feature which was introduced in this game is a damage system, or more specifically a limb damage system. Through this, the wrestler's body is broken up into head, arms, legs and torso. This means that, for example, if you spend the entire match working on your opponent's legs, they'll have difficulty walking on them and be more susceptible to submission holds focusing on their lower body. Submissions were also revamped from a defensive point of view. So rather than tap outs randomly occurring upon application, now there is a minigame where the player must mash or time button presses to escape holds or reach the ropes. Minigames which naturally get more difficult the more damaged and fatigued you become. Aside from this, the typical array of classic wrestling moves, as well as your favourite wrestlers' finishers, are present and accounted for. It must also be said that the animations had improved significantly in Here Comes the Pain when compared to previous titles. Whereas in other games the moves were recognisable, they were all hit with the same generic intensity. Here, however, a Lesnar F5 is delivered with that freakish explosiveness, a Kane chokeslam really drives the opponent through the mat, and an RVD Frog Splash displays his real-life counterparts' unparalleled athleticism and flexibility, etc, so on and so forth. The one thing from a presentation point of view that will be instantly noticeable is the lack of commentary or in-ring introductions. The absence of the former is actually not really a bad thing. Commentary in wrestling games have always been a weak point. Whether it's down to laziness, lack of time, or simply due to the extreme difficulty in replicating the complexity, fluidity, and chemistry of real-life wrestling commentary, it never quite hit the mark, regardless of how good the game was overall. That said, I kind of wish that they had ring introductions. Again, as with the soundtrack, it seems like an unnecessary oversight, which I can only imagine must have been down to negligence or laziness. Now that we've established the sleek gameplay mechanics and relatively impressive visual presentation, the next question is, how do we experience all of this? Fortunately for the player, there is an extensive list of match types in which you can display your grappling prowess, as well as utilise some unique mechanics. Along with foundational matches like single one-on-one matches, traditional 2-on-2s, as well as 6-man tags and handicap matches, there is a massive variety of special matches for players to sink their teeth into. These again range from conventional to speciality to frankly bizarre. On the conventional side you have the Royal Rumble matches, cage matches, ladder matches, submission matches among others. While your speciality matches include the infamous Hell in a Cell, TLC, or table, ladders and chairs, and 3 stages of Hell matches. Another speciality match includes the Elimination Chamber, which made its debut in this game, which makes sense as it only debuted in the actual WWE a year prior at the 2002 Survivor Series. As it was at that event, the Elimination Chamber match in Here Comes the Pain was one of the freshest and most exhilarating additions to the franchise in years, pitting 6 men against each other in what basically amounts to a chain-linked coffin. The other 2 new match types fall under the bizarre and mediocre banners. Now, I will admit that the First Blood match has nothing fundamentally wrong with it. You just basically have to attack your opponent's head until they start to bleed to win the match. However, the major problem here is that on television, First Blood matches have a crescendo that can only really be achieved through careful scripting. Without this kind of predetermination, nothing really separates this mode from a traditional singles match, as many players will spend their time beating their opponents' heads in regardless. What's worse, due to the nature of the match, victory can, and often is, attained not only by using a signature move, but before even hitting a finisher at all, sucking all the drama out of the situation. Worse still is the bra and panties match, which literally just pits one female wrestler against the other in an attempt to rip each other's clothes off, rendering them nude sans said underwear. Now, I'm not adopting a feminist or white knight stance here, but frankly anyone that has an issue with partial female nudity, no matter how degrading, should question why they have no issue watching men equally or even more nude, covered in baby oil, wrestling each other. Nothing about this offends me, it's just a waste of time. The only thing truly offensive about these matches is the ridiculous lighting and woeful gameplay mechanics, which were either an afterthought or an example of the developer literally unable to better execute a genuinely shit idea. And why is there a referee in the ring for a match with no pinfalls or submissions? Unless old Earl Hebner is just trying to make a big deposit in his wank bank. This was also one of the last games to have a big backstage area, made up of a variety of areas including a locker room, boiler room and a parking lot. All of these areas can be accessed in the hardcore match type. What makes this match fun is the way you can interact with these backstage environments. Highlights include putting your opponent on a treadmill and dragging them along while you're riding a motorcycle. The weapons in matches like this, as well as the TLC and Hell in a Cell matches, are predictably fun to use. Even today, there's nothing quite as fun as driving your opponent through a table. Another success in Here Comes the Pain are the creative modes. Granted, one area in which the series never stagnated are the creative modes, and they would only expand and become more nuanced as the years rolled on. But for where the series was in its evolution at the time, Here Comes the Pain's creative options were the best the series had seen up till this point. Containing mostly holdovers from previous games, the most extensive of these is the actual physical Create-A-Wrestler one. Even going back to games like No Mercy and SmackDown 2, Yuke's and THQ games were known and lauded for their deep creating modes, and this game is no exception. And Here Comes the Pain, you can customize your wrestler's hair, facial structure and size, eyes, mouth and nose, including shape, size and colour for the former. You can customize their physique, including the ability to shape individual body parts like legs, shoulders and abdomen. You can choose their skin colour. You can assign them a wide variety of attire, both in-ring and out. You can alter the colour of their clothes and accessories, as well as add specific logos and designs to them. Create a Moveset is one of those modes that can only be as good and extensive as the moves and options available in-game to the other wrestlers. And as we discussed, Here Comes the Pain offered a much more varied, dynamic and accurate looking moveset than any other game up until that point. The biggest creation feature notably absent from this game as it pertains to its inclusion in later games is the ability to create your own finisher for your created wrestler. Granted, it will be 5 years and a gaming generation later before we would see its inclusion in a wrestling game, so you can't really fault the limited hardware or the time of its release for its absence here. Still, in the unlikely event that the rumoured Here Comes the Pain remake comes to fruition, the ability to create your own signature move would be a must-have feature. One of the more quirky features in Here Comes the Pain are the creatable animations. This suite allows you to create a walk, run, fighting stance, win celebration, and taunt for your created wrestler. The latter two are pretty standard and offer reasonably deep customization options for the time. However, it's the former three options that show off the developer's signature sense of humour. The same developer that would allow you to make your wrestler 10 feet tall and make their skin colour bright green in previous games. Here you could give your wrestler a limp while they walk, have them skate while they run without skates, and adopt a ballerina-inspired fighting stance. You can also isolate certain limbs, giving them separate animations from the original. This leads to some genuinely hilarious animations, and while you wouldn't apply the sillier among them to your favourite created wrestler, you can't help but appreciate the funniness and creativity on show here. So now that you've gotten a feel for the game, played through some of the match types, and created your dream wrestler, probably a better looking, more muscular version of yourself, it's time to give the story mode a whirl. Story mode is perhaps what Here Comes the Pain is most well known for, as well as what it is most fondly remembered for. While perhaps not quite as deep as many of us would like to remember it being, with rose and nostalgia tinted glasses, it was still the freest and most complex story mode in a wrestling game to date. When you think about it, that's really a damning indictment of wrestling games today. How, 18 years later, no one was able to come along and create a more engrossing story mode is actually really shameful. That being said, the pure depth isn't the only attractive aspect of the story. It's also the time in which it takes place. As I mentioned, Here Comes the Pain takes place during the tail end of the Attitude Era and the beginning of the Ruthless Aggression Era. That means that the cool presentation, stage design and risque content is present also. Things that would be missing even if a future wrestling game was able to make a story mode of comparable or even greater quality and depth. The other sweetener is the roster. Not only do you get to play as these characters in singles matches, but having the ability to play as or encounter characters like The Rock, Stone Cold, Kurt Angle, Shawn Michaels, Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit as active competitors as part of your story is something that cannot be replicated, unless they actually did a remaster of Here Comes the Pain. The story mode lasts a year, and can play out in a few different ways depending on if you play as an established star, a mid-carder, or a created wrestler. After most pay-per-views, an agent or general manager will approach you with offers to chase certain belts, feud with certain wrestlers, or even forge alliances with people. And while the consequences of saying yes or no to these offers may not be as significant one way or the other as you'd like to believe, just having the option to dictate your own destiny, as insignificant as it may be, is a huge mental plus for a gamer. It makes you feel more in control and like you're almost helping writing the storyline. This sense of freedom was an exciting prospect for 6th generation gamers, and it really made Here Comes the Pain feel like it was something special. That said, the usual high spots are there. Unless you really mess up, you'll most likely win the Royal Rumble and headline WrestleMania. But it's the moments in between, forming an alliance with a tyrannical boss and turning heel, accepting the managerial services of a young lady, or taking a detour to challenge for a mid-card belt like the Hardcore title, that fans will remember most fondly of all. This video was a little bit shorter than other ones I've done in the past, and in a way I don't mind cutting it short for this one. It's not because the game is bad, quite the contrary. For fans of late 90s, early 2000s pro wrestling, or just for fans of good sports games in general, it doesn't get any better than this. The reason it's a bit shorter is because SmackDown Here Comes the Pain is exactly what it appears to be. One of the greatest wrestling video games ever made, and nothing more. There is no deeper subtext here. It doesn't pretend to be anything more than what it is. A super fun, arcadey wrestling simulator that has a stellar suite of creative options and game modes, and which is a blast to play. It just so happens to be one of the finest examples of the genre in execution, and that's why it deserves to be called a classic game.